This is the all-new Mitsubishi Outlander plug-in hybrid, and it has some pretty big shoes to fill. The previous version of this car wasn't only the world's first plug-in family SUV, it was also the world's most popular plug-in. Since it was introduced about a decade ago, Mitsubishi has sold more than 300,000 of these things, and the good news is that this new version is a significant improvement. It's got a bigger battery, longer electric-only range, more performance, and unlike the previous car, you can now have it with 7 seats. The bad news is it's going to cost you at least $16,000 more than an equivalent Outlander powered only by petrol. So the question is the plug-in hybrid worth it? Let's find out. I'd like to start by saying thank you for watching another one of our video reviews. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Why not subscribe to our channel? And if you have any questions about the new Outlander PHEV that I don't cover in this video, dive in the comments and let me know. I'm sure I'll jump in there and answer your questions as best I can. Okay, let's start with what's under the skin of the new Outlander PHEV, because really that's the only key difference between this car and the conventional existing Outlander range, which is the powertrain. So prices kick off at 55 grand for the ES PHEV and top out at the Exceed Tourer for just under $70,000. So unlike before, we now have a plug-in variant in pretty much right across the model range. Those prices are at least a $16,000 premium compared with a petrol-powered Outlander, but everything else stays exactly the same aside from the powertrain. So standard equipment, how many seats you get, how much it'll tow, that stays exactly the same regardless of your powertrain choice. In terms of the powertrain itself, a key difference with the regular Outlander range that already exists is the petrol engine. So the petrol-only Outlander has a 2.5 litre naturally aspirated petrol engine, but that's actually taken from Nissan. I'd also argue it's probably the weakest point in the Outlander. It just feels a little bit down on power. It's okay, it's effective, but it's not the most inspiring engine to use every day. Now, the plug-in hybrid, however, uses Mitsubishi's own powertrain. It pairs a 2.4 litre petrol engine with a battery and 2 electric motors. So an electric motor on the front axle and also an electric motor on the rear axle. The petrol engine, it's pretty old, but it has been optimized for this application and it's not too noisy. It's actually quite a refined unit to use, which we'll get to when we talk about what this car is like to drive. The battery pack. All of the electric gubbins have been really optimized for this generation of Outlander PHEV. So the battery pack is mounted low for a lower center of gravity between the 2 axles, and it now measures 20 kilowatt hours, which is just shy of a 50% increase over the previous model. Electric only range, Mitsubishi claims it is 84 Ks, which is pretty impressive actually. Charging times. Okay, so if you're going to plug this into your normal plug at home, using a normal socket, it's going to take about 9.5 hours to get a full charge on a 20 kilowatt hour battery. If you use a wall box, that's going to cut it down to about 6.5. But if you find a DC fast charger using a CHAdeMO plug, it's going to take about 40 minutes to get 80% worth of juice. So it's not too bad, and most people are going to charge this car at home overnight anyway. Electric motors. Now, it's basically the same setup as before, but the motors themselves are all new and they are more powerful. So the motor on the front axle, it's about the same size, but it now produces 85 kilowatts, 255 Newton meters. And the performance gain of this new PHEV is actually pretty impressive. So a petrol powered Outlander will do 0 to 100 Ks in around 10 seconds, a bit over 10 seconds. The plug-in hybrid, 8.2. It's a similar story with the electric motor on the rear axle, which has been totally re-engineered and now produces 30 kilowatts more. So on the rear axle alone, we've got 100 kilowatts and 195 Newton meters. But the best bit is that the actual motor and control unit itself is 50% smaller than the previous Outlander PHEV, and that means it doesn't eat into boot space. So the boot space here is exactly the same 485 litres as you get in a regular Outlander. And we also have 7 seats, which you didn't have in the previous Outlander PHEV. The system for erecting the seats is actually quite different to the normal Outlander, which you just sort of pop the two rear seats up. This is a bit like origami in a way. There's quite a complicated little 4-step system, I think, to get those seats up. It's not a real 7-seater. It's kind of like a 5+2, but it does give you some flexibility that other SUVs in this segment don't offer. Another big boon is that towing. If you fit a tow bar to this vehicle, it's exactly the same 1,600 kilograms braked towing capacity as you get in a petrol-powered Outlander as well. Inside the cabin of the Outlander PHEV, well, it's exactly the same cabin as you get in the rest of the Outlander range, but it's definitely worth mentioning because personally, I think the interior of this car offers the biggest improvement compared to the previous generation car. Mitsubishi has long traded on being, cheap and cheerful, a value offered brand, but certainly doesn't feel cheap and cheerful in here. Actually, it feels pretty premium and it does major on luxury. The variant we're in now is the flagship Exceed Tourer, so just under 70 grand before on-roads. And it certainly does meet the expectations of a 70 grand car. All of the touch points are nice and soft. The mix of materials is actually impressively premium. So we have nice soft touch leather on the seats. We've even got diamond stitching, which is pretty cool. And the rest of the cabin feels really modern. The design, there's lots of horizontal lines on the dash. The infotainment screen on the dash is nice and large, easy to use as well. And also the fully configurable digital dial cluster. It all screams, 2022. It feels very modern. And the best news is that it hasn't foregone functionality in the pursuit of, premiumness. So unlike some brands like Volkswagen, which are starting to bury all of the key functions inside the center screen, we still have basic ergonomic functions. We've got all buttons here for the HVAC controls, and the center screen menu is very easy. The logic is easy to understand. So it's not going to be a frustrating car to get used to or to use on the move, which is a big tick. Second row, also worth mentioning. It's probably not the roomiest second row in this class of mid-size SUV. There is a compromise for having those 2 extra seats in the boot. So it is a 5+2 seater. Don't consider this a genuine 7-seater. And there is a compromise for second row room when it comes to having to fit those extra seats back there. But the seat itself is nice and comfortable. The cushion base is quite high, which is great for kids so that they can look out the window. Might be a little bit too high for adults. You kind of feel like you're perched up a little bit. But the second row, I would say it's probably adequate rather than a real highlight for the new Outlander. Okay, so what is the new Mitsubishi Outlander PHEV like to drive? Well, despite all of the powertrain complexity that we've got going on, which I'll get to in a minute, the actual driving process is very, very simple. You jump in, chuck it in gear, and away you go. And first impressions are that it actually feels more like a full electric vehicle than it does a conventional hybrid. And when you get in, the instant response that you have from the powertrain is probably one of the key attractions to jumping in this car. You don't have any of that hesitation that you get with a conventional ICE powertrain. Instead, you just sort of swiftly and instantly move away from the traffic lights or from a standstill. The calibration of the system is also very impressive. The petrol engine itself is also nicely refined. It's kind of isolated, so even when it does fire up, it doesn't do so in an uncouth way. And even when you start to rev the petrol engine out, it's never vocal, it's never coarse, it doesn't kind of ruin the sort of tranquil experience that you have in this car, which you're just wafting along silently, easily. You feel like you have large reserves of torque, which of course you do. This car has 450 Newton meters for a system total output compared with, I think, 245 Newton meters in a regular Outlander petrol. So we have a significant bump in torque, and you do notice that just driving around town. The other thing that I love is just the instant response. So that's full throttle there. It's enough to sort of push me back in the seat. I would call this car swift rather than fast, but there's certainly enough performance to justify a step over the regular petrol-powered car. It does feel quicker, and that's magnified by the fact that you have that performance low in the rev range, and it's instant. The rest of the drive systems are a little bit complicated to wrap your head around, so they're kind of split between the electric side of the powertrain and the drive mode. So we have 4 different settings for the the battery and the 2 electric motors. So we have normal to begin with, which the car's brain figures out how to best use the petrol engine and the electric subsystem to deliver what you're asking of with the throttle. Then we have full EV mode, which does exactly what it says on the tin. It really prioritizes the battery and the electric motors. There's also save, which retains the amount of battery charge that you currently have. So you have 16% left to go. You'll have 16% when you get home to plug it in. And finally, we have charge as well, which uses the petrol engine as a generator to put more electricity back into the battery. So there are sort of 4 settings for the electric system, and they combine with 7 different drive modes. They're the usual things: normal, tarmac, and a few off-road modes as well, plus eco. There's also a power setting here, and you need that power setting to really unlock the extra acceleration that you have in the PHEV over a petrol-powered car. So when you have the car just in normal, despite the instant low-down response, the 0 to 100 time is about the same. It's just over 10 seconds, and that's the same as a petrol-powered car. But when you engage power mode, which we will a little bit later when the road gets nice and twisty, you shave that 0 to 100 time down to 8.2 seconds, and that is fairly rapid for what is a big family SUV. The other part of the electrical powertrain to talk about is regen braking, because this car now has much stronger regen braking than it had before, and it's actually available over 6 different settings. What you learn with this car is it's almost got a setting for everything, but happily, once you sort of wrap your head around it, it's actually fairly easy to use. So you engage the regen braking by using the paddles on the steering wheel, but even without sort of engaging the regen modes, there is a sense that just in normal mode, there is sort of a subtle regen to the powertrain when you come off the throttle. Certainly more than you get in a normal ICE powertrain. But when you pull a paddle, the default setting is B2, but you can go all the way down to B5 by pulling the left shift paddle, which increases the regen. You pull the right shift paddle to decrease the regen, and I'll put it into B5 now, so the strongest one on the paddles, and as you can see, the regen is actually fairly strong. But if you want to go stronger again, there is a 6th setting which you engage by pushing this little button here on the center console, which looks like a throttle pedal with a little whooshka symbol around it. And when you push that, you have what Mitsubishi calls is almost one pedal driving. So as you can see, the regen is significantly stronger now. And when you lift off the throttle, we're coming up to an intersection now, it'll almost come to a complete stop. So we're cruising along at just under 10 k's an hour, going slightly uphill. So if you're driving around town using the one pedal driving, you will need to use the brakes for the final part of coming to a stop, but it's actually a nice system that will in cut and thrust city traffic, you can just use single pedal driving, which a lot of people like. Okay, so what's the Outlander like to drive when you start to throw it up a challenging, twisty road? Well, it's surprisingly fun, actually. So adding all of the electric motors and the battery has really increased the weight of this car. It's about 340 kilograms heavier than a conventional Outlander. That's a big bump. But on this twisty road, you don't really notice it, actually. Body roll is nicely contained. The steering is very accurate. It's on the lighter side. I'd probably appreciate a little bit more heft, but going into tarmac mode, which we are now, it does add a bit more weight to the steering. It's very accurate. The gearing of the speed of the rack is very natural, which is great. And yeah, I would say for a family SUV, this car is actually surprisingly talented and fun to drive up a twisty section of road. The ride and handling balance is also pretty nicely judged. So day-to-day driving, there is a nice sort of suppleness to the primary ride, and it does feel like the chassis tuning has been treated to a decent degree of finesse. But there is an Achilles heel to how this car rides, and that is when you hit sharp imperfections like manhole covers or really big bumps. And this road here actually is surprisingly bumpy. And And when you do that, it can send an unpleasant jolt or shudder through the car. Things like that. That one wasn't actually too bad, but when you catch a very nasty bump, it can sort of bang and jolt through the cabin. It's unpleasant enough, I've learned this from personal experience, that it can actually wake a sleeping baby. See what I mean? A sleeping baby in the back seat. Part of that is down to the big wheels. So we are in an Exceed Tourer. They ride on 20-inch wheels. I think from Aspire above, get 20-inch hoops as standard. And that, you know, that is a large wheel, and it kind of feels like the big wheel is the big thump that we're experiencing through the cabin. If that's a problem for you, the ES, the entry-level ES, does roll on 18s, but I was driving that car earlier today and it didn't quite deliver the improvement in ride quality that I was expecting for a 2-inch difference in the wheel size. It's certainly better, but it's not a night and day difference, unfortunately. Another benefit worth mentioning is that the braking system of this car is nice and natural. So unlike previous plug-in hybrids or even regular hybrids where the brake pedal can feel a little bit odd, has like a fizzy sensation at the top of the travel, and it's very difficult to modulate the pedal. The brake pedal in this car feels like a conventional brake pedal, and that's great. It gives you the confidence to push on and sort of drive the car quite quickly and swiftly, knowing that you have the right level of stopping power when you need it. In terms of the rest of the cabin experience, well, this generation of Outlander is a huge step up when it comes to cabin refinement. We're on a slightly coarse chip road now. There is a little bit of tire awe to contend with, but it's certainly not a deal breaker. And I know from personal experience, having driven this car interstate, it is a very good long distance cruiser. Cabin refinement is impressive. Putting both kids back in the back seat, the boot is just big enough to load all of the stuff that a family needs for a big trip. So in terms of, see what I mean about the ride there? It's probably the primary compromise with this car is the occasional thump and bump that you get from the ride. But as a family SUV, there's a lot to like here. The cabin is very nicely presented. The general sense of quality is nice and high as well. And with the PHEV, you get a nice sense of instant response, premiumness to the powertrain that you don't have in the petrol car, which when you start to really ask a lot of the petrol engine, can get a little bit vocal and probably doesn't have the level of performance that you want. This car does have an appreciable step in performance. It's also quite impressive when you compare it against the other plug-in hybrids in the market. So probably the most logical rival for this car is the Ford Escape PHEV. But even though it's a little bit cheaper, it has around half the battery capacity of this car, half the EV-only range, and not the same level of performance that this car offers either. So in that regard, the Mitsubishi PHEV does come out favorably. So as a complete package, I actually think there's quite a lot to recommend about the Outlander PHEV. The biggest hurdle is that initial outlay to get into it compared with a petrol-powered car. But if you're of the type of person that is willing to pay that price premium, you are certainly getting a better powertrain, one that uses less fuel, one that offers more performance. Drivability is superior as well. And the rest of the package has no real downside. You can still tow the same amount. You've still got the same 7 seats. The cabin is beautifully appointed. All of the equipment levels are nice and high. Well, I think as a whole, the Outlander PHEV is actually a very convincing thing.